People have challenged her to grow and help others grow. Like many of us, she fell into evaluation while working on something else and found that it stuck. While evaluation is her trade, raising the voices of those too easily overlooked, not heard, and not heeded is her passion. She has spent 17 years having conversations with mothers who lost their children to foster care and writing the book, Give Me My Child Back. Give Me Back My Child, How the USA System Kidnaps Children, in order to ensure their voices are heard. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Fierro over the past 7 to 8 months, and she is exactly the person we hope to find. She's a driver of hope, a person who has a different perspective of what
So I just have to make one correction, because in communities of practice, mislabeling your titles can create havoc. And so the Art of Hosting Practice, which is a facilitation community and a practice for creating spaces in our meetings that are just like our living rooms. They're like open and natural and free. And so there is no official certification process in the Art of Hosting Practice. There are practitioners, and then there are stewards who have been stewarding the practice for decades. And I'm not a steward yet, but I am an avid and passionate practitioner. So most folks who talk about communication and evaluation expect that we would talk about communicating results, right? It's the part of our job that is stickiest, most familiar. And although I try to tame myself here and there, which mic am I using? Lavalier? Okay, great. All right. So although I try to tame myself, I have a tendency to break format and break expectations, and I'm an innovator by heart. And so what I chose to talk with you about today is not how we communicate results. I won't be talking about that at all. But looking at who are we communicating with and who are we talking to in the earliest stages in our evaluation. Like when we're in the offices talking with a program manager, or when we are establishing the measures for success, or even at that first contact with the client, right? So I'll be focusing there and then talking about how important that is for the impact that it has on the evaluations that we drive and the lives we live. Because communicating well with people has a lot to do there as well. Listening for what's happening in your personal lives too. If you're a person who worries about saying the right thing at the right time or the wrong thing at the right time, like I am, or was for a while, you're in for a treat. A lot of what I share carries over to our personal lives too. We're in critical times because we can see that people are pivoted drastically opposite each other. With an increase in mass shootings, hate groups, and war, many people live in fear. And the loss of the human capacity to suicide, drug addiction, or addictions of various types, death, self-destruction, is really tragic. And at the bottom of it all, we're all yearning to connect. I'll get more specific. Being human is a really messy thing. Put any two humans in a room, and the likelihood of miscommunication, according to one study, is 50%. So 1 in 2 chance of miscommunicating. It's also likely that conflict can ensue when we miscommunicate. So when we communicate, something happens. We're vulnerable. We put our hearts on the line. My eyes meet yours. My humanity meets yours. My vulnerability meets yours. There's a risk every time we're eye to eye with another human being. And when we're vulnerable and in that risk, we are uncomfortable and often react to what people say or how they say it. Now take our military capacity. We have weapons of war that are daunting in their power. We have perfected how to maximize death and minimize risk. We can kill hundreds of people from far away with a missile or a drone without ever having to be vulnerable ourselves. Never having to hear the other side of the story, never seeing a tear on a face or blood on a severed leg. Never really seeing and getting the impact of our actions. As a planet, our capacity to destroy is much higher than our capacity to be honest with one another while looking each other in the eye. I'm going to say that again. As a planet, our capacity to destroy while avoiding each other is much higher than our capacity to be honest while looking each other in the eye. We risk self-destruction because we have such a great capacity to destroy. And our survival as a species depends on seriously developing our ability to communicate when we disagree, face to face. I'm not surprised that trolling on the internet, people who make nonstop attacks online from behind a computer, is so popular. It's a reflection of how we fight, farther and farther away. We dismiss the impact of our words on the human being on the other side of the screen. And while we fight harder, we feel more disconnected than ever. A 2016 poll showed that almost 72% of Americans experience loneliness. So this is why communication is critical. We are more miserable more of the time, and our public good, the survival of our species, the thriving of our species, depends on it. So as you can see, I'm passionate about communication, but I don't work on it because I'm good at it. I work on it because left to my own devices, it sucks. So come back in time with me for a minute. I'm bicultural. I'm Italian American. I was born in the Bronx and moved to Italy when I was 10, where I spent 15 years. And I'm the first generation in my family not raised on a farm. Also first generation college educated. I was born in New York City by Italian parents who, when I was born, had been there almost 6 years, at most 6 years. My family dynamics were laden with the pressures of most immigrant families. My mother had only spoken English for a year when I was born. My dad, who had completed only third grade in Italy, learned English on the job as a tailor, learning the minimum he needed to get by and provide for his family. Dad worked 7 days a week. Mom missed him. My brother and I fought most of our childhood, taking out on each other the frustration of a home in a constant state of stress. So you can imagine that our household was a place of conflict, and that was normal. So when it came to communicating, there were only two ways: withholding and bursting. My father could hold a silent treatment on my mom a whole month despite living under the same roof. My mother could start yelling at the drop of a hat and often did several times a day. No middle ground, silence or outbursts. I carried this over into my consulting life and had a rocky start. I learned to keep everything in. I thought that keeping it in, like my dad, and not bursting, was professional. In my early years, I lost several clients to miscommunication. We didn't use words the same way, we didn't interpret social justice in the same way, we had mismatched expectations, the client asked me to not say what needed to be said, or take out of the report critical feedback that I knew needed to stay. Silence or outburst was a terrible communication model for me in our profession. Turns out, having hard conversations is the foundation of being an evaluator. I had to learn, so I went on a journey. And I'll just add this about my boisterous Italian family. Even with all the bad communication and miscommunication, we have so much love for each other. My mother is a fierce communicator. She will say what she has to say no matter what. She expected the same of us. I learned from her more than I can explain. So here's an example. One day after a bad fight we had, I go into the kitchen and my mother had been cooking for 7 hours straight, from 6 a.m. to 1 p.m., which is Italian lunchtime. And I go up to her, I'm like, Mom, we're 3 people. What are you doing? You're cooking for an army. And my mom goes, you can say that you came from a dysfunctional family, but you will never say I no feed you. So the biggest lesson in my conflictual family and from my mom is that no matter how loud we yelled at each other, no matter how bad it got, and no matter how much we were hurt, we would always be back at the dinner table the next day at 1 p.m. And if we weren't that quite that next day, give it 1 day time, and we would be back there. And so from this, I learned to trust that humans can create beauty, connection, and love from any conversation. So if you're one of those people who thinks that communication is nice and tidy, kind of like that, a perfectly ironed linen table, well, I hate to burst your bubble, but it's more like this. Good communication is real, it's authentic, it's profoundly alive, and it's human. And human emotions are messy. Yet the messiest conversations can yield the sweetest results. Sort of like tangled phone lines. They look messy, but they get the job done. So if good communication can be messy, what exactly makes communication good or bad? So I'd like to tell you to give up judging communication, but since we're a crowd of evaluators, I won't. So here's your metric. Judge communication not by how it is delivered, but by the impact of its delivery. If the communication fosters what you're out to create in the world, consider it good. Otherwise not. When communication is good, there's a flow of information, people feel free, alive, and open with each other. People gain confidence after the conversation. So sometimes, like in my family, folks can yell at each other, but get closer too. It's fitting for a Southern Italian woman to tell you this, isn't it? Given Italians' reputation of being loud and boisterous, whatever we're talking about. So what makes a communication bad? And I have it in quotes. So quite easy. If you feel more disconnected after a conversation or lack thereof, or if your results you're trying to create don't come to fruition, you're probably experiencing bad communication. And bad communication is very common. And studies on the impact of bad communication in the workplace say bad communication generates low confidence, low morale, mistakes, low productivity. So there are a lot of risks here. So I'm going to take a break from this for a second. And I'm going to go a little bit in a circle. I'm going to take you away and then take you back. I'm not much of a linear speaker, but I'm sure I trust the quality of your intellects. So in West African cosmology, there's a concept of Nomo. And the Dogon people, who were some of the indigenous people of Mali, believe that Nomo was the beginning of it all in their creation story. Somewhat like the Bible, that starts with, in the beginning was the Word. So in Nomo, in African cosmology, there's this concept that Nomo is the human's ability to create magic by naming things. Like the power that the word has that no other species has but humans. And of course, that's questionable. We now know that probably other species have language too. So the driving power that gives life and efficacy to all things is nomo, the word. The spoken word, the sound of the drums, the laughter of the throat, the poem and the song constitutes the magical force that activates and enlivens all other forces. So it's not that the West Africans are saying that nothing exists outside of language, they're saying everything is dormant outside of language. And language is what activates it, is what brings it, makes it alive. So words have the power to create anything. Peaceful words generate peacemaking. Tolerant words create tolerating. Cynical words create cynicism. And so the cost of bad communication is super high. So back to our project lives, 40% of projects go badly because of communication. And here's an interesting, the following 2 bullet points are not specifically about communication, but the World Bank, actually, the commission, I think I took that out of there. Yeah, the independent evaluation group saw that 39% of World Bank projects were unsuccessful and 50% of projects in Africa were unsuccessful. So why? And there's this great report that I read online that has all these like complex categories. It's like structural breakdowns and planning breakdowns and contextual and management breakdowns. And I would say that 80% of them boil down to communication. And so the fear that we have is this fear of failure. Like that's often what's driving the conversation and the negative impact of communication. We all have horror stories of how something went wrong, and this fear oftentimes guides the way we interact. So what happens when we're in this fear of the failure of communicating, like the failure of the breakdown? What happens is that there's this loop that's created. And the parts of the loop are me, you, what I think about myself, and what I think about you. And that just generates the loop over and over again. If you have low expectations of someone, they're never going to say something smart enough for you. Right? If you believe your wife has nothing to contribute, she won't. Because that's where we're listening from. So the loop is determined in evaluation. This looks especially interesting, right? So this is like the impact of that loop, right? So I'm trying to communicate, the other person's not getting it, and we just get louder and louder and louder. And our brains process the way they process. So this is a funny other little cartoon, right? So who hasn't seen someone go on a trip to a different country and just get louder? Right? As if being louder is going to make us communicate better. And this is what we do. That's the loop. It escalates. So this is like how we start our evaluations. Right? We start our evaluations with program managers that say, I know it works. And us who are thinking, no, you don't. So think about the foundation. Before we open our mouths, this is present. Like this is the undelivered communication. It's like what is not spoken. Plus, just to make things a little stickier and prettier, there's like this, right? So this is where the project manager is also coming from, right? Like, I'll do whatever you need to do for me to get more money. And of course, that's not our mindset as evaluators. And if that's how the relationship begins, it's unlikely to get better. So if you listen to your project manager as someone who disregards your evaluative opinion, nothing your project manager will say will modify your approach. If you listen to your evaluator as someone who asks for too much, nothing they suggest will make sense to you. And so it's no surprise that projects end up kind of like this, right? So that's how the programmer wrote it, how the business consultant described it, and how the project was documented. Like the way we document our projects often don't come alive for the very people who are part of it. And that's the loop. We're talking more, and yet we're understanding less. So let's see what needs to happen for us to break the loop and give up boring and effective conversations. Who wants a moratorium on boring conversations? Right? So the fundamental, one of the big myths around communication is that it changes based on how you talk. And what I'm here to tell you is that the foundation of communication is how you listen. Like that changes everything. So what we hear is grounded in what we want to hear. And the way you listen is simply about one thing: power. Who we listen to and who we ignore is a matter of power. In Western societies, domination is trained, taught, learned through not listening. Look for the connections between how you listen in your personal life and your professional life. They're connected. So this is learned. There's no stigma here. We all do it. We're taught this. It's integral into our culture. In my culture, Southern Italian culture, it's quite common that men don't give much weight to what women say. It's art. It's part of their patriarchy training. The reason men in my culture don't listen to women is because they don't have to. They hold the formal power. So if they ignore women, there are limited consequences. In Western societies, this power dynamic is everywhere, not just between men and women. Parents tend to listen less to children, the elderly to their grown children, whites to people of color, first world countries to people from developing countries and indigenous folks. The philosophy of domination that gave way to colonialism and imperialism was grounded in this assumption. Pope Alexander VI in his 1493 papal bull said that his desire was that the discovered people be subjugated and brought to the faith itself. So when I choose to subjugate you, you do not have to ask. I don't have to ask what it's like for you. I need not your input to claim my authority. I reserve the right to subjugate you and take your land because you have nothing that I need to respect. No soul, no rights, no voice, no laws. And of course, this was the doctrine of discovery that our nation was founded upon. And it's not grounded in truth. It's grounded in self-interest. And this didn't stop in the 1400s. So how many times have you heard a program manager say that the participants did not participate in the measures for success because they're not interested, won't come, or have nothing to say? If you're folks who use these excuses, I ask that you seriously consider that you haven't created the conditions to really listen. Here's a project example. A failed project on the lake of Turkana in northern Kenya. $22 million invested to create a fish plant. There was no consultation of the local Turkana people. The plant was closed in 3 days because mainly it was too hot to run the refrigerators all day. So maybe the local people who never ate fish but were nomads who were based their food on cattle, like maybe that was wisdom. Like maybe they survived in the desert that long because they learned that like storing fish would not work. And here we go, decades later, and make that plan. So my invitation to you is that you learn your bias. Oh, and then it doesn't help that in our field, jargon is fancy, right? Jargon is classy in our field. For us to talk without people actually understanding us is fancy. We like it. So I'm inviting you to know your biases, because your biases are implicit in your culture, and every single culture has one. So as an Italian-American woman who lived 15 years in Italy, I have a positive bias for directness, passion, physical closeness, eye contact, and food. right? I was trained as a woman to see white men as the authority and dismiss the contributions of people of color as irrelevant and simplistic. I was trained to be an expert, always, even when I don't know what I'm talking about, generalize my experiences, offer advice, focus on me instead of we, and speak as if I know what I'm talking about. As a white woman, I've been trained to be nice, not rock the boat, and not take up too much space. I clearly do a really bad job at that. So all these characteristics hold up the status quo and undermine the contribution that I and you can make in the world. In my evaluations, if I act from these biases, I will have no contribution to make, but dismiss the opinions of people who don't look like me, or be a wallflower paper myself. So some of the blind spots that are carried in our profession, we're trained to debate, not build consensus. We're trained to be right in conversation and not join ranks. We're trained to suppress unspoken voices and not uplift them. And I know a lot of folks are doing stakeholder work. I'm not saying that that no one's doing stakeholder work and stakeholder engagement, but there's a piece about the academic training that still teaches you to be the expert and not have them be the expert. And of course, there are a lot of approaches in evaluation that are working. Culturally responsive evaluation, transformative evaluation are working to shift that, but it hasn't shifted for the whole field, not quite yet. We're trained to be the gatekeepers. So as people are highly educated, we often speak for folks who are left out and are expected to filter their participation as well. So if we walk away from the idea of communication as fear of failure and of all the things that don't work, what is left is this incredible opportunity. And it's an opportunity to break that loop of me, you, what I think about you, what I think about me. And breaking that loop can really give space to something new. So at the core of every conflict or tension, there are often two concepts that we think are opposites. And in the facilitation community, we call them dynamic tensions. So a difference between two viewpoints, approaches, or belief systems that are perceived as being in competition. The competition generates the tension. So some folks may speak up, and each one gets louder, and when the tension is static, we go into this they'll never understand, and we just loop around. Have your stakeholders in the room with different perspectives and actually see that as an opportunity. So that takes seeing differences of opinion as an opportunity, always, and not a threat. And my experience is that most folks who are excluded from the evaluation planning process are excluded because someone in the admin is scared of the conflict that will ensue if they're in the room. That's the bottom of all of this. So, and I have a blog on how to have inclusive conversations, and inclusive conversations are one where differences are seen as an opportunity and not a threat. But when I talk about balancing opposites, I know what you hear. You hear a compromise. I wanted a cat, my wife wanted a dog, we got both. So everyone's unhappy in the compromise, because no one wanted it that way. We wanted it the way we wanted it, right? So when I talk about balancing opposites, I'm actually not talking about compromise. But the key here is that as evaluators, of course, we don't tend so much to objectivity anymore because we see the limitations in that term, but neutrality. And neutrality means taking the time to hear all perspectives. So that third solution can only be found. So there's a third solution that you can find that isn't a compromise, but is actually an underlying idea that can come forth only through the opposition of those two sides. And when it happens, it's truly a moment of magic to watch a group debate and then find that third way. And it's a win-win for both sides. It's generally a creative and innovative way to come forth. And so the third solution, though, can only come forth when both sides have fully heard and danced with each other. Trying on for size the other person's perspective and being honest about the ways that there are differences. There's much literature, the technical term for this is emergence, and there's much literature on it. Here are two authors, Peggy Holman and Otto Scharmer. And what Peggy says is, emergence is order rising out of the chaos. And so emergence takes on a different facilitation approach than most people use. It's less about facilitating and pushing and pulling the conversation, and more about building the trust that anyone can contribute at any time and allowing the conversation to be messy and direct the conversation in the most subtle of ways with an inquiry question. So it's a group of people who are inquiry around a question with very different perspectives. Under that umbrella, everything is allowed, from your personal life, your professional life, art to intellect, heart, and mind. So allowing people to be like 360 degrees themselves when they sit in your meeting. They'll show up in a very different way. So one of the things Otto Scharmer points out is that for this to happen, for that emergence to happen, it's the you. Groups had a kind of like, the down is like go down and dirty, if you wish, and then upwards is when the ideas start coming, and that center at the bottom of the U is the turning point. And he says, for that to happen, there has to be an open heart, an open mind, and an open will. And it boils down to like two sleepy brains, like one excited brain takes two sleepy brains to make an excited brain. Like two brains are better than one. And that when people come in the room, if you're actually believing that every person is wise and has something to contribute, there's a very, very different space that you create. So I want to give you a quick example here that in terms of like being an evaluator and being critical friends. So I have evaluated a trauma training for police and community in Newark, New Jersey. And Newark, New Jersey is one of those cities that was found guilty by the Department of Justice of abuse of force in communities of color. And so the trauma training is used as an opportunity to actually build relationships between police officers and community members. So when we first drafted the plan, of course, it's a training, so we focused on like attitudes and attitude change and behavior change and satisfaction items, like we started there. And then we had a visioning session, somewhat like what we'll do in the breakout session later, where we actually sat with folks and we asked them, what is it that they saw could happen? So one of the questions was, tell us a personal story that involved violence, how was it handled? And in the wake of trauma events, what would be the best response of police in your community? So we had people like sit with the real questions and the tough questions and the elephants in the room. And oftentimes when we do evaluations, there's an elephant in the room that the community wants to talk about. And if we don't go there, what happens is that elephant in the room will sabotage our evaluation in some interesting or different ways. And so what came out from the session is that what folks really wanted was mutual understanding. And so with the vision of mutual understanding, the training was tweaked, the evaluation was tweaked. We didn't know how much mutual understanding we could promise in 3 sessions. But that's what we've worked on. And by having it in our eye, there's definitely some of it that has been created. So as evaluators, I'll just say this quickly. So if this is the iterative process of evaluation, what I'm challenging you to think about is who is involved in those beginning stages. A lot of collaborative evaluations, like in the beginning stages, have like 5 or 10 or 15 stakeholders tops. Like, what would it be like for folks to actually in community be in conversation and think about what success looks like, which is what we did. And then for us to be accountable to the communities and not just the funders. And when you learn how to use these practices, what you discover is that you actually also learn how to balance, like how to find the third way between what the funder wants and the participant wants, right? Another dynamic tension right there. So as evaluators, these are things that we have to take care of, right? Seeing opposite perspectives, truth-telling, uncovering assumptions, disrupting comfort, delivering bad news, including excluded voices. This is part of our work. These are all hard conversations. Our professions demand that we learn to have these conversations in a relaxed, serene way. It is risky, no doubt. So my invitation to you today is for you to build your capacity to have hard conversations by learning how you listen and by learning to leverage dynamic tensions. There's a lot you can read, but know these skills must also be practiced. So have yourself in workshops that will teach you the practice. Were we to avoid these kind of conversations with our clients, we would have abdicated our evaluative role and become simply professional figures who do complicated studies to sanction the status quo. Everything is exactly the way it is. Hard conversations carry a risk. We cannot get rehired. But the risk we run for not having hard conversations is much, much more severe. It's that our profession will lose all credibility of neutrality and independence and become simply the arm that sanctions what already is, to the detriment of the voices that are already not heard. So think about it. Every project you get hired on, there is someone who has not been heard. The anonymity and the trust you can offer them may make it their last opportunity to be heard. And the wisdom they carry can make a difference between the project being successful or sinking forever. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we live in critical times. We're either on the brink of a world that works for everyone or the brink of extinction. The middle path is dying. We are in a time of extremes. I invite you to break the loop of repeated conversations by shifting how you listen, recognizing your biases, and leveraging many perspectives in any conversation. I also share that deep listening, creative listening, generative listening can lead us not only to survive, but to thrive. So how can you walk in your life to have the impact you desire? How can you make a difference in the world that matters to you? Commit to listening, heart, mind, and soul, for what is said and for what is not said. Commit to listen even when you're not listened to, and watch magic show up in your life, both business and professional. Watch the exhaustion of communicating the right way fall away, and connection grow. So as you build your capacities through reading and workshops, practice with your colleagues. Bring boldness and grace to your practice. Create a community of people who can point out your blind spots and who see the power dynamics, who see your biases and see them when you miss them. Because this work can only be done in community. So as you attend your conference today, I invite you to ask yourself the following questions. Who am I avoiding because they don't think like me? Who is the authority on this topic? What voices have not been mentioned? Who is this work having an impact on? What do they think? Where in my work do I ignore, fail to listen, or override? Who is this project being accountable to? The funder, the staff, the local community? And as you ask for these questions, find a colleague who's doing the same and create a listening accountability partnership. This work must be done in community. Find a community that will hold you accountable for listening like your life depends on it. Because it does. Are there questions?
What if you work with a group who does not want to share information with everyone? Like work that help in a small group.
Beautiful. Great question. The question is, what if you work with a group that doesn't want to share with the whole group? So one of the things that I do in all of my evaluations is I do a lot of pre-work. So that session, that visioning session took at least 2 or 3 months of prior conversations. And so the core evaluation team is a group of people that are like as representative as possible of the larger group that you want to have. So I would have discovered that in preparation. And so you plan for it. So if there's something delicate of that nature that people don't want it and you really want to gauge the data side of it, you can do a journaling session and then have people share. And you take away the like handouts so that you have all the information and the folks who feel safe can share and the folks who don't still have something to offer you. So there's a lot of what you can maneuver, but the key is to really know the group you're working with before you do a session. Like, take time to discover what's the elephant in the room for this group, this community, this point in time.
And then from there, figure out how to express.
Hello? Can you contextualize this pre-work? You said you do a couple months of pre-work. What does it mean? You call people individually? What does that look like?
So it starts generally with a conversation with the project manager about who are the stakeholders in the group and what are their relationships. And of course the relationships and what are the subgroups. They generally ask what the subgroups are. And that's generally like the end of the conversation with the project manager because that's typically very sensitive. And so I offer confidentiality and I'll say to them something like, you know, as a facilitator, things are gonna come up in the room. And the more I know ahead of time, the more equipped I can be to leverage it in a positive way and not have it hinder my work. So anything you can tell me about how this group typically interacts, like are there some groups? Are there folks that hang out alone in the cafeteria? What do they think about the others? What are their discontents? What's the beef they have with each other? And then at the end of that conversation, I'll discover what the core team needs to look like. So the core team needs to have, like if there are 2 groups who won't talk to each other, the core team has to have that. So for the police community work, our core team had both police officers and community members and professionals because we needed to toggle with those issues. We couldn't have a shared question and a shared conversation if we hadn't like trialed those issues first. So that's a little bit of what it looks like, and a lot of these ideas come from how art of hosting practices work and how gatherings are organized. They're organized with this like long-term discovery of small conversations that then inform the big conversation. You basically do consensus building with a small group before you get to the big group. And I can share more resources with you on that.
When you're, hi, my name is Nicole. Hello, my name is Nicole. When you're saying that you're selecting someone to give you insight on those within the group, how would a person trust that person that their observations are not biased? So when they give you the information and you're trying to formulate the differences or conflicts within the group, you're using another person's lens to determine that. So to me, it seems like it is better as a professional to use your own lens in order to eliminate a second party's bias. How can that help?
Well, I also have my biases.
but then you have two. You have
Yeah.
2 layers of bias at this
There's
point.
bias for every breathing human being in the work. So it's how we
So
work
how do you,
with our
what I'm trying to
processes.
say, what I'm asking is how to trust that process. Why can't you start off if you're doing these meetings in advance and someone is coming in as outside leading, why can't that be the vision that you work with and then work from the infrastructure from there instead of using someone else to provide you information on how these groups interact or individuals?
It depends on how much you know about the community. So in the case of Newark, I don't live in Newark, so I was going in raw, like with no knowledge of what the history and the connections were there. But to your point, I think what's really wonderful about what you're saying is that ideally we could, like you have your conversation with your program manager, you have your first group, and then you have the conversation who's missing. And then have that group of people tell you who else needs to be in the room. Yeah. So it's like the more people you bring in the room, the more likely you are to have the whole picture, which is really what we're hired to do as evaluators, is have the whole picture. Yeah. Anyone else? How many more minutes? Wait, okay, great.
Hi, so
Hi.
thanks for the talk. So in the way that you're describing the work that you're doing,
A project admin, and I have the others be the evaluators who are walking in to get a contract, who are advocating for inclusion. And the students have a ball, because they say like, it can't be this bad. I'm like, no, it's exactly this bad. Like, they have nothing to contribute, they won't come, they won't have childcare. And I think depending on, so to me, the work of bringing inclusion to our work is, it's a crack in a dam. So there's the dam, there's the crack. You're kind of like there's a leverage point that you're doing. And I do it inside of my commitment that every voice be heard, but it looks different for every client. So for one client, it may just be surveying because they really don't want to hear anything. So you do it in the format that they're most comfortable because they would never want them to meet. They're like, oh my God, if they meet, they're going to build a movement against me and we're going to be done. Right? So when you're dealing with that kind of fear, and then you build it up. But the question, get it. And there was just this, and then the heat rises because they also feel not heard. So it gets higher and higher and higher and it escalates. And on the other hand, you have the officer saying, you guys don't get how freaking hard it is to do this job. I get no breaks. I'm working 36-hour days times, and I go from a murder to a domestic violence to another murder to a substance abuse to a mom who beat her child. Like, you have no idea what I take in a day. How dare you judge me? And so the dynamic tension there, right, are that both sides, what they're saying is they're both true. Like, humanly, you can't say to either side that.
Thank you for the talk so far. It's been very valuable for me. Thinking about the example that you gave, like personal responsibility versus collective responsibility. So what I was thinking about was like my own personal values, understanding of social justice and equity. So while it is important for community members to understand the individual frustrations and difficulties that officers go through, right? Like, I would want to see a world in which that comes second to the needs of communities of color and Black communities and how they're viewed by police. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about how to create like a neutral space that is not that still maintains equity and still challenges the status quo.
Question.
So I think that's the skill set, and it's not a toolkit. It's a learning curve. What I have to say over wanting the community needs to come first is that over years, those concerns are coming to the surface, but it takes a lot of building because we're evaluators, so we're paid by the powerful, and we're talking about folks who have less formal power, right? So, but in this case, the project was advanced by a advocacy organization, financed by an advocacy organization. And so over the course of 2 years, Actually, the police department is now the one advocating that this be spread out to the whole department. So the police department asked that it be placed in the consent decree, which is the list of requirements that the DOJ needs. And we're in that process. We don't have like final conclusions yet. So I would say the how to make the hold the space is a place for lots of training. How to hold the space in an equitable way in collaboration. I only do this work collaborating with folks of color. Like I will not work in partnership with someone who's not a person of color, especially when I'm dealing with issues around race, but issues of race show up anyway, everywhere. So I try best to collaborate always with a person of color, because what happens is that my biases and their biases, right? So it's like we're able to go back and forth, and then I have a person to check me if my white privilege shows, right? My underpants start showing, right? Like all this stuff shows up that isn't that. And then they learn in the process, which is what we do as evaluators, right? So they learn in the process how to actually get there, and then they become the experts that actually know what they're doing in the best case scenario. So a lot of like setting expectations around we're on a learning journey together. I don't have all the answers. There may be places of discomfort. I have some conversations with clients around reports if it's a first year. These days, one of the reasons I got fired from a project is because I did a truth telling around race in a report, and they wanted me to take it out, and I did it. And I didn't get rehired. And these days, I always have a conversation with them before they see the report. Listen, this is what the report is. There are going to be recommendations, because even your funder wants to see there's places for you to grow. Like, it doesn't mean you have a bad project if you have recommendations. Like, recommendations are an integral part of the process. There are going to be limitations, because part of my transparency as an evaluator is to share how the process went forward and just preparing them so they have a little bit more. And then the other piece is really about pulling back. So I was thinking about this while your question, Melanie. So some of those original conversations, those core team meetings, they're often trialing conversations. So I barely talk, and especially in the beginning, I barely talk. And it's just, and there's a lot of like, what are we doing? I don't understand. You asked me to be in this meeting. I don't know what we're doing. I was like, I don't know, what are we doing? Well, how's this gonna help? Well, I'm trying to understand, like, what are the relationships here, and what does it need to be said? What is it that we can? It's like, well, I don't understand how this relates to my real life. Yeah, that's right. Where is your real life? Tell me about it. And it's some of that actually being willing to step back and not give the answers, not too fast. And that creates a ton of discomfort. Like, people really want you to be the evaluator and have all the answers. Like, I hired an evaluator, for God's sake. So, what are you doing?
Yeah, so I really like
Last question.
your point around good communication having more to do with listening than talking. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on, because I think ascribing to that viewpoint takes a lot of trust and vulnerability, because if you go out on a limb and say, okay, my purpose here is to really understand you, you're sort of trusting that the other person is going to do the same. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions beyond just pure modeling of the behavior for how to get a large group of people who might not be familiar with that practice to sort of buy into that and try it out.
So, 3 things. Let's see if I can remember all of them in line. One, I think we have to build that's part of having the hard conversations, is building our capacity to be vulnerable first, which takes a ton of trust. And we often fail. We think that we have to trust the other person. It's not actually, it doesn't take trusting the other person, it's trusting yourself to get through it no matter how it goes. And so that's work to do, and there are trainings that do that. So I've been in like a 1.5 year communication work with landmark education, and they all work on what are you listening from? Are you willing to put yourself out there? Like even when you don't feel safe or you feel vulnerable and so on and so forth. So I think that's a muscle to be developed. And one of the reasons it's super important is because when you hold space, if you're comfortable, your folks will be comfortable. Because the way you show up, it's like, if you put your feet on the couch, people know they can put their feet on the couch. If you don't, and you have a white couch with plastic like my relatives do, you know you will die if you put your feet on that couch. I don't care how much plastic there is. Right? So when you hold the space, the way you walk in the space is where other people are taking cues from you. That's all the nonverbal communication. And the other big piece about this, which I didn't mention in the talk, is acceptance. So this work borders with organizational development work. I generally partner with someone who does organizational development work and is an organizational specialist. And what happens is that you...
Yeah, she was telling me in our last class that she was going to do surgery. She doesn't have to work.
This session and my keynote was created with the contribution of Rita McPhail. Don't go anywhere. Am I pronouncing her last name right? Yes. McPhail? Okay. So Rita's been on the board for 14 years and just completed her president. What World Cafe is designed to do is simulate a conversation in a coffee shop. And so as you can see, part of it is setting tables in a way that is not consistent with conference practice, right? Because I want you to know that here you can be as you would in a cafe. So you can, the conversations that we're meant to have are conversations where we're alive, we get down and dirty, or it's okay for you to be fully 360-degree yourself. You artist, you dancer, you grandparent, you mother, like be exactly who you are and bring everything about your life to this table. That's what I'm asking you to do today. So I'm asking you to not show up as the professional who can only be this part, because if they talk about themselves as mother, or if they talk about themselves as grandparent, or artist, or survivor, that the group will not welcome it. So I'm asking you to be part with me of creating a space where every single person in this room can be fully themselves. Are you in?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have, we have 2 guiding questions for you. We're going to do 2 rounds of cafe on these 2 questions. And then come together to see if we can come to some cohesion around some of the topics that came up. We're super challenged because this is supposed to be done in 2 hours, and we had 1 hour and 15, which are now I think 1 hour. So just know that if you feel a little rushed, you are. And I apologize. I do my best to not rush people, but just know that if you feel like you could be in the conversation longer and you don't have a chance, that actually if you did the technology with the proper time commitment, that you would have more leisure and more breath. And after we complete, I'll share a little bit about how I've used this in evaluation. Or I may just take questions, because I mentioned it, like I talked a little bit more about it in the keynote, just for you to fiddle. Listen to understand, right? So listen to understand folks. We talked a little bit about this in the keynote. So try to not listen to react. Try to listen to understand what they're experiencing. Focus on what matters and slow down. It's okay if there's a break, if there's a pause in the conversation. Like, let the pause be the pause, let it breathe. right? So listening and speaking are like inhaling and exhaling, right? So let the conversation breathe. If there's silence, there's nothing wrong with it. All right. So here we go. Here's the question for you. And I'm so excited that we're having this conversation because I think it's a conversation that's really critical. And so just so you know, I see you. This is not just like a cute exercise for a conference, although it is a cute exercise for a conference. I see you on the edge of the evaluation profession in terms of having this conversation. Like this is a conversation that we need in our profession, right? What is happening in the world? And so I'm really excited that we're having this conversation today. And so the ripples will be, the ripples will be shared with your board, but there may be also other things that are birthed from it, because everything's birthed in conversation. All right, any questions about the process? All right, I'm gonna give you a set amount of time, and then I'm gonna stop you. And when I stop you, when I come back to the front of the room, since we're behind on time, I need you guys to like be super, super present to when I'm trying to get your attention back. All right? Which doesn't mean you have to look at me, but when you hear me, please come back. All right? Ready? Go. What is most critical in our field right now? What is most critical in our field right now?
Getting B-roll, so don't worry, there's no audio.
Policy. I think it's interesting because it's in like the general.
Strategic goals regarding communicating and allowing that individual to have a voice. So that's what I say.
So yeah, I'm going. Yeah, she puts sustainability. And I think with like the fast pace of things too, it's hard to know like, because their society's fast paced. You don't even answer like we were talking about the I guess it's not experts. You don't ever know that just like came up, you know where you're going. Right. So Sean's just one more like
that pressure to be an expert on something that you necessarily don't know anything about, and that fear of working in front of people. Personal experience, I'm the type of person who overanalyzes everything I say and do, so I don't like to speak until I
asked a question and it's completely obvious. No, I didn't mean to ask a question.
So take the green Post-it notes, the dark green ones that are on your table. Ignore the lines. What did I just say?
Ignore the lines.
Ignore the lines. They're not supposed to have lines on them. Ignore the lines. So 2 Post-its, share 2 highlights from your discussion. And they should be use the markers. It's just like 1 sentence at most. All right, 2 highlights, 2 key points or 2 highlights that came from your conversation. Ready?
Yeah. You know it. I forgot how to spell stepping for a second.
You're making me want to draw right now.
There you go. Okay, so at this point, I'd like the groups to report out. And how many of you guys have been read what's on the Post-it? No explanations, no preambles, no conclusions. Got that? And it's just so we can get a sense of what it's because we have tight time constraints, otherwise that'd be a little bit more of a gap. Could you start? Sure.
So we started out talking about how in our field we see our I was thinking about speaking and okay. Advocacy and visibility for ourselves and others.
Say it one more time.
Advocacy and visibility for ourselves and others. And we need to spread evaluative thinking.
Do folks here on that side of the room? Did you repeat it? You know, mic check.
I'll do this one. Trust and inclusion, data and research, accurate in and evidence-based out.
So they actually. How we connect across from different perspectives and improving or telling a story about how programs for one population work.
Culturally relevant programming paired with culturally responsive evaluation and data accuracy and integrity.
Establishing a definition of success that's meaningful for both the funder and the community served.
Ongoing internal evaluations to maintain sustainable programs and services, i.e. evaluations of self, practice, and macro environment. Importance of finding balance between stepping back from the fast-changing world while also embracing it.
Thank you.
Adverse childhood experiences / unpacking trauma and effective communication with the focus of community stakeholders.
Accountability and equity.
The folks who stayed at the table, take 30 seconds. 30 seconds means 3 sentences. Okay? 30 seconds to share where the conversation was before and build upon it with the next question. And then, so the host, the person who's at the table says, hey, how you doing?
Embracing the fast-changing world while also taking time to step back from it and realize where you're at, where you've been, where you can go. And then we also talked about society's lack of reliance on factual things, facts and results. And then we see it permeating into the academic world now. And then another one was our ongoing internal evaluation and the importance of doing that and documenting it.
So now you're at what can we do about it?
Yeah.
So maybe
Those who use data.
need a desire for learning opportunities and practice opportunities.
Mentor type program to help out young professionals.
Interesting.
We've got training and professional development and feedback from other professionals or MAE members to enhance evaluation plans, outcomes, and reporting missions. Effective communication with funder, program, and evaluators and others on the project, and identify SMART goals.
We had demystifying evaluation field / practice and professional development conversations around difficult conversations with clients.
So we had addressing the gap in experience and knowledge with more frequent networking events and webinars, and overall just more consistency and outreach.
We identified 2 types of internal evaluation, both self-reflection by the evaluator and ongoing reflection of the project. And we said that MAE can identify and host critical questions, accountability indicators, ongoing learning community of evaluation professionals.
Oh, our group said they could provide training as well as bring in community voice.
And the last 2 groups?
Share knowledge with broader community and be intentional.
Okay, we thought that from communication that MAE, what we could do about it is, first of all, to answer the question of who we are to the different individuals with a quick elevator speech. How do we do it quickly to a different group of people? And the other part we said is tools and defining for communications, expectations on communications, not just for us as the evaluator, but the group and further down to the individual to find the heart of change.
So taking what to be a resource for the community. It's not, coming to this conference and being a resource back to what community that we came from, because not a lot of people know about the MAE. And so taking what we learned from these conferences and applying it either to our current organizations that we are in or to the organizations that need it the most in our communities. And be intentional about doing that.
That's good.
We're all what's alive.
Getting more people involved in the evaluation process. And I think that will improve our accountability to those we serve. And as far as the organization, we were talking, the two groups of ladies that I had here at the table, because I've been at this table, and we were talking about the organization, about MAE, and the fact that I really didn't find out about the organization until I was a student at Wayne. And I had an undergrad, some classes in undergrad and evaluation, so I knew about the organization. But there's not a lot of folks, it's not a lot of information out. And I think we perhaps maybe can come together more often as a community.
So more than once a year contact?
Yes.
A few other folks back there mentioned that, right, around like newsletters and networking. Do you want to build on that?
Yes, so I agree completely with that. Because, like they said back there, how are we going to kind of demystify evaluation if we're not having a constant presence and showing our face? So we have to make sure that we're sending out something to just let people know who they are, where we are, and you know, you can join in on this too, type of thing. So I think newsletters, webinars, workshops, any networking events especially, is vital when it comes to, you know, being inclusive of everyone and getting the word out there.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say, I think that this question of, am I loud enough? Am I hearing? This question of MAE's visibility perhaps could help our organizations think more inside out about evaluation, so that evaluation is not something that organizations, nonprofits are thinking about at the end of the project, but that's something that's integrated in sort of how we're rolling projects out, how we're designing and how we're implementing.
Yes,
for sure. And if I can add on to that, I think one of the ways we would be able to do it as far as MAE is, again, kind of the advocacy thing, but we publish a lot in our own journals, and we don't kind of translate the interdisciplinary value of it and put it right in the face of different organizations on here's the values we go. Not
Values? So you're saying we don't do a good enough job at stating what our values are and what the role of our values is in our work?
I'm trying to say, sorry, I was mumbler. I was trying to say that I think we have
doing that would be to show evaluation, package evaluation as something about improving programs, and programs are there to serve the people, so helping programs to improve things, not to judge, not to look at it as a punitive thing or something where we're judging in a negative way, but that we're trying to work for social betterment and uplift people.
Right.
Measurements of the organization's outcome and impact, everything, so that they're reportable and accountable to the.
And so just know that like parts of this conversation carry over for me in my practice as well. So thank you. They're all like little tassels of a mosaic. Thank you all. If anyone's interested in the book, I have it here. Or a card.
No worries.
Before that partnership was solidified,
So which grade are you at? Oh.
Okay, and what do you love in
Yeah,
And you do it in college?
Yeah, so we do evaluations around colleges and sports all the time.
Oh, okay, beautiful.
Oh, she here? Yeah, these kids on track to school or sports games just not. No, they won't tell
I'm broken no more, so I like.
You have your what?
I like.
Did you say business broken no more, or is it a book?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's my philosophy. Broken no more. I like taking an individual that's broken. Oh yeah, and making them all.
Yeah.
Transforming.
So do you healing work? How do you do that?
Through motivational therapy. That's one. Yeah.
Thank you.